Hey everyone, welcome to the first lesson of our first real app. Now you probably noticed I actually called it lesson 0 instead of lesson 1. And that's because in this lesson, we're not actually going to start working on our project yet. So technically it's not really lesson 1 in building our app. But do not skip this lesson. Even though we don't actually start building our Xcode project yet, this lesson might be the most crucial one of all if you actually want to learn how to think like a programmer as you build your apps. Because that's exactly what this lesson is all about. How to think like a programmer and what our mindset should be as we build our LOTR converter app. Now, to start off, I'm going to be totally honest with you and say I'm not going to cover every possible scenario or perspective that we could consider as we build our apps. There are limitless ways to think about it, and every programmer thinks about things and organizes things a little different. But I will give you a general overview of common app architectures and show you how most apps are generally organized and built. So most of the time, there are 3 main parts to an iOS app. And then there are also lots of additional things or smaller attachments or services or whatever that you can add to your app as you need them. But let's start with the main 3. Every single app you'll ever use or that you'll ever build will have a view, something that the user sees. Now again, we're talking about iOS app development. There are plenty of non-iOS apps out there that run in the background and the user never sees anything, and there are even iOS frameworks that don't necessarily build any screens or views. But all the apps we're going to build are meant to be used by people on iOS devices. So, in other words, they're meant to be seen. So there has to be a view, something the user can see. The next main part is data. What data is behind the app? And data could be anything from, for example, tasks in a to-do list, or the map data in a Maps app, or whatever else. Everything that you have in your app is basically data. That includes text, images, even your app icon is data, and then of course any records stored in a database are data. The way I like to think about it is data is basically the resources, files, and information that you use in your app. And the last main part is in between the view and the data. And it's basically how we manipulate or control the data to get it ready for the view, or in other words, get it ready to show to the user. And then also to take the user's input, like if the user taps a checkbox on a task, then the manipulate part would take that input and change the data to mark that task complete so that the data in the app reflects the actions the user is taking, such as checking off tasks or sorting a list or even deleting some data or whatever. And what does manipulate even mean? I looked up the definition, and it's just to handle or control, typically in a skillful manner, and then a more specific definition is alter, edit, or move text or data on a computer. So exactly what we're doing. So that's the 3 main parts that every app has to have. It has to have some data, then we manipulate the data so that it's, you might say, view ready, and then we display the data on the view. We show it to the user. Or we don't show it to the user, but it somehow drives the views or it helps us decide what we do show to the user. Now, as we think of all this, I keep talking about the user. That's another part we need to think about, is what mindset or perspective do we have? How are we looking at our project? Are we looking at it from the perspective of us, the developer, sitting in front of our computer looking at a bunch of code? Or are we looking at it from the perspective of the user who's downloading and using our app on their device? And the answer is, we have to look at it from both perspectives. Not always at the same time, but we have to think about it from our perspective, the developer, as we decide where we get our data, how we organize it, how we organize our code, how we organize our project files, how we name things, how we document our work, and so on and so forth. So there's a lot of things to consider from the perspective of the developer. But then we also have to look at it from the user's perspective. And that helps us decide how we lay out our screens, how we present things, how we draw the user's attention to certain parts of our app, or certain new features that we release that we want them to try. Now, those are the two main perspectives we need to consider. But also, we might need to consider the perspective of Apple, because they're the ones that review our app to see if it's even allowed on the App Store. So we need to think about how to make our app reviewable, how to make it easy for a reviewer to kind of use and understand our app, and even what information and extra context we might provide to the reviewer when we submit our app. Maybe we're building an app and we're hoping to get investors on board to help us build the next huge social media app or something. So we need to consider what an investor is going to think as they use our app, and even as they review our Xcode project maybe. So we would think about how to make our code look clean and how to document it in a way that someone else can come in and see what we're doing. Now at this point, I think I want to take a step back and say, don't get overwhelmed with all this. Don't get caught up in the details right now. I'm talking about a lot of different things here, and you might be thinking, I'm not going to remember all these little details and all these questions that I need to ask. And that's totally fine, because as we go through these lessons and build our app, I'm going to refer back to all of these different things we've talked about and remind you of what we need to think about and what questions we need to ask. And really, the two most important things we consider is what we need and how we're going to do things as the developer, and also consider what the user needs or wants from our app. So with that said, let's go back to those three main things and get into a little more detail. Let's start with the data. What should we think about as we start to make decisions on the data within our app? Well, we have to ask some questions. One question is, what data do we need? Another question, what data do we want? But maybe we don't need it, but we want it. Another question, where are we going to get our data? Are we going to create it and provide it ourselves? Is someone else going to create it and then we get it from them somehow? Or maybe both. Maybe we're going to get some data from outside sources, and maybe we'll provide some of our own data. And how are we going to get the data? Whether we provide it ourselves or get it from someone else, is it going to be included in our app project? Or do we need to fetch it from some online database when the user first launches the app? Or do we wait for the user to take some action in the app and then just fetch that little bit of data that they need right now? Also, what format is the data going to be in? How is it going to be organized when we get it or when we create it? And you know what? There's all sorts of other questions. We honestly don't have time to go over all of them because there's a ton of questions we can ask about data. But we also need to ask some questions about our view. And there's no hard and fast rule that I follow that says I have to ask my questions about the view first or the data first or whatever. Honestly, an app idea kind of comes to you and gets developed almost like a brainstorming session, where you just have all these random thoughts that are semi-related, and then you start making connections and bringing some structure and organization to your thoughts. So some questions about our view. What data is going to be shown to the user? And how is it going to be shown? Meaning, are we going to have a big list of data all on one screen? Are we going to split it up into multiple screens? And how are we going to organize it on the screens? Are we going to make it big or small? What parts of the data needs to stand out and be very prominent so that the user sees it first? And even, how are we going to code our views? Are we just going to throw all our view code in one big code file with hundreds or thousands of lines of code? Or are we going to build each individual part of our view as a separate individual thing? And then if we do that, how is each part going to communicate and talk to each other to make sure our app looks and runs as one unit without any errors or miscommunications or stuff like that? And then some questions about the middle part. How do we manipulate our data from how it's organized when we get it to how we need it organized as we show it to the user, or as it drives our view from the background? And even some similar questions to the other parts. Do we build all of our manipulation code all in one place, or do we separate it? And if we separate it, how does it communicate with the rest of our app to make sure everything works well together? Another thing we consider is what parts of our code have access to our data, and what parts have access to our view. And does any of our code have access to both, or neither? And how do we specify that access or limit it where it needs to be limited? And even we can ask the question, why does it need to be limited? We have to know all these things because we're the ones making these decisions. There's a lot of questions we need to ask. But again, don't start feeling overwhelmed. As we go through the app, I'm going to kind of reiterate these questions as we build each part. So for now, let's take a look at our LOTR converter app and ask some of these questions. Now, you guys are lucky, because one bonus that you have that you won't have most of the time is that I've already gone through and asked a lot of these questions and made a lot of these decisions for these apps that we're going to build. So you won't be starting from scratch, at least on the apps I'm showing you. As you build your own apps though, you will have to be the one to make that ultimate decision on all of these things. So I'm going to bring up all the screens from our finished LOTR converter app. Now, just taking a look at these screens, I already see that we need at least 3 views because we have 3 screens, and a view just means something that you can see. And actually, I'll show you as we get into the project, but a view doesn't always take up the whole screen. It's kind of like Inception, actually, if you've seen that movie. It's a pretty cool movie. But oftentimes, a view has other views inside of it. It's like viewception. So let's take a look. So here we have our main view. Let's say this is our main screen. So that's the main view. And inside of here, we have an image view right here. And the background is another image view. And we have a text view. And we have another image view and a text view and a text filled view. And this view and these views and this button view. So basically there's views all over the place. And they come together and work together and communicate with each other to build our main view, which is this whole screen. But it doesn't stop there. Our main view communicates with these other 2 views, and they all work together to run our entire app. And I'll show you exactly how we do that as we go through the lessons. But let's start asking some questions and getting some answers from what we see here. So one of the main questions, what data do we need? Well, it looks like we have some images. Images count as data. We have a background image and another background image. So we need these 2 different background images for the different screens. And the one on the right just uses the same background as this one over here on the left. We also have our currency images, which are also repeated down below. And we have this prancing pony image. And we even need to think about not just the data we can see, but any data that is kind of implied by what we can see here. So we can't necessarily see this, but we can make a pretty good guess that there's probably some sort of currency data that has actual numerical value to it attached to these 5 currencies we see here. So we need currency data. Part of that currency data is the values, the numerical value of each of these. And then there's the images, the currency image, and the currency names. Each of these has a name. So all of that is data. And then remember, one of the other main questions we asked about data is, how do we get it? Who provides the data? Is it us or someone else? Well, again, in this case, you're lucky because I provide the data. And you can just download it, and then I'll show you how we put it in the app and how we use it. Now, a lot of these questions we'll answer as we get to that part in the app. It wouldn't really make a lot of sense to sit here and answer every single question right now, because 1, we'll probably just forget anyway, and 2, a lot of times we can't really know the answer until we get to that part and just figure out what works best. We can try to plan things out as much as possible beforehand, and we should, but in the end, we make the final decision as we build it and see what works. So there's one last part to this lesson that I want to say before we start our project. It's my 2 rules for programming. Rule number 1 is organize your project, meaning your data, your files, your code, everything in your project. Organize it however you want. Whatever you feel like works best for you and the app that you're building. Now, be careful how you take this. I do highly recommend organizing it somehow. And there are some really good, common, popular ways to organize an iOS app project. But at the end of the day, you're the one that has to live with and work with your project. So you might as well do it in a way that works and makes sense for you. And throughout these lessons, I'll show you how I like to organize my projects. And if you like my way, then just follow along and do it the same way. But if you don't, if you think of a better way for a certain part, then just do it however you like, whatever works best for you. Now, if you're hoping to get a job in the industry and work with a team of developers, you probably should understand and be comfortable with using some of the common ways to architect or organize an app project. The two most common in iOS development are MVC and MVVM. Those stand for Model View Controller and Model View View Model. I'll have another lesson that goes into more detail on both of these, but for now, just be aware that if you're working with a team on a serious iOS project, most likely you'll need to follow some best practices from one or both of these design architectures. And I actually follow these in my projects too, so you'll be getting some good practice as we go through the course. Programming rule number 2 is never type anything more than once if you can possibly avoid it. Now let's look at our app again. And already you can see here, for example, that we have 5 different currency icons. But they're all designed the same. So how do we get all 5 of these without typing the code 5 separate times? Well, I'm going to show you that when we get to that lesson. And that's exactly what I'm talking about. Now, I actually came up with this rule on my own when I first started, but it's actually a common programming practice called DRY, D-R-Y. And it stands for don't repeat yourself. So if you find yourself typing the same code over and over, or even similar code, try to find a way to only type it once and then just use it when you need it. And again, I'll show you how we do that in this app when we get to those lessons. So that's it. That is an overview of how we kind of think about things as a programmer, and how we also need to consider things from the user's perspective. And again, as we go, I'll be repeating some of the things from this lesson, so if you feel like you might not remember everything we talked about today, that's totally fine. We'll go over it again when it's more applicable. So in this lesson, we talked about the different perspectives we need to have and the different questions we need to ask as a programmer to build our apps. Then we took a look at the LOTR Converter app and asked some of those questions and started getting an idea of how we're going to go about developing this app. Last, I gave you my 2 rules for programming. Organize your project in the way that works best for you, and do your best to avoid having the same code in your project more than once. In other words, don't repeat yourself. In the next lesson, we're going to set up our new project, and I'm going to give you a quick walkthrough of Xcode and show you how we use each part to build our apps. So I'll see you in the next lesson.